Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
The following is a talk I gave recently for LibertyCon 2025 in Washington, D.C. I'm here to talk about monopolies, but I'll be using the word monopoly much more loosely than any economist should. When it comes to speaking English, economists cause more confusion than a libertarian arguing for privatized roads. We take perfectly reasonable words that come with all the nuanced baggage that well-used words accumulate. We redefine them to mean something completely new, and then wonder why no one understands what we're talking about. For example, the word benefit, something that promotes well-being. We redefine to mean the dollar value of the utility gained from consuming a specific quantity of a product or service. For those of you studying economics, this is why you don't get invited to parties. Monopoly is one of these words. To the economist, it means a single price-setting seller. To everyone else on the planet, it means a big and likely bad company. Notice the emotive words in the common definition. In the minds of most real people, monopolies are the dragons of the marketplace. Their power is both feared and legendary. Our elders pass on tales from their elders about monopolies that swept in and devoured entire towns. But as with dragons, you'll be hard-pressed to find someone who has seen one. Also, like dragons, that's largely because natural monopolies don't exist. Picture a spectrum. On one end sits a natural monopoly, a single rent-seeking, profit-generating, inefficient behemoth. On the other end, perfect competition, a bustling bazaar of equality, homogeneity, and zero economic profit. Partway along this continuum, people draw a blurry line and warn, beyond here there be monopolies. But in casually applying the term to any large company they don't like, people have lost sight of what a monopoly is and when it should and should not be feared. Take Apple, for instance. Is it a monopoly? It is the only company that makes Apple products. In that sense, it's a monopoly. But that sense is meaningless because we don't buy iPhones, iPads, and Macs because we want Apple products. We buy them because we want smartphones, tablets, and computers. Things also made by Google, Samsung, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, and many others. If we cared only that products were made by Apple, regardless of what they did or how well they did it, then Apple would be a monopoly. Since we care more that the products are specifically smartphones, tablets, and computers, then Apple is really one among many competitors. And the numbers speak clearly. Globally, iPhones represent only a quarter of the world's smartphone market. Love them or hate them, Apple is much less a dragon than it is one among a flock of squabbling pigeons. What about Google? The European Union recently fined Google $2.7 billion for monopolistic behavior. Google handles almost 90% of the world's internet searches. Certainly, Google is a monopoly. Not so fast. The whole point of being a monopoly is that you can charge those sweet, sweet high prices. Yet Google prices its search service at the not-so-stratospheric point of zero. Yes, Google records all of our information, but despite the fact that most of us would be horrified if our searches were made public, we go on happily giving up our data in exchange for cat videos and to creep on our exes. Our behavior says that we place no value on our information. Therefore, to us, Google's price is zero. Despite its 90% market share, Google looks even less like a dragon than the squabbling apple pigeon. What about Amazon? If there is a modern-day exploiter like the company towns of old, surely it is Amazon. But Amazon faces competition from Walmart, Target, Best Buy, Costco, and via eBay, every person with an internet connection looking to unload their grandmother's china. Amazon not only faces competition when it sells, it also faces competition when it hires. In Seattle, Amazon employs 90,000 workers who complain about their working conditions, but there are alternatives. Boeing, Microsoft, the University of Washington, and thousands of other businesses collectively employ 25 times the number of people that Amazon employs. I make no comment as to whether Amazon is a good employer. I merely point out that in employing less than 5% of Seattle's workers, Amazon faces fierce competition in the labor market. Apple, Google, and Amazon aren't even close to what economists consider natural monopolies. But Apple, Google, and Amazon are very large and very dominant companies. And that's what people mean when they call them monopolies. So, are monopolies a bad thing? It turns out the answer is it depends. It depends on why the monopoly is a monopoly. And here something interesting emerges. There are two reasons a company might become a monopoly. One is that someone somewhere is using force to prevent competitors from selling or to push consumers into buying. Let's call this a coercive monopoly. For example, pharmaceutical companies employ strategic patenting not to protect their intellectual property, but to make it too expensive for competitors to compete. Many states protect car manufacturers and dealerships by prohibiting manufacturers from selling directly to consumers. This makes it impossible for a new competitor that doesn't have a dealership network to sell to the public. Local laws require residents to pay for public schools regardless of whether their children attend. Coercive monopolies arise through the violation of consumers' or competitors' property rights. We're told that coercive monopolies are examples of market failure. In fact, they're examples of government failure. A coercive monopoly exists either because the government failed to protect people's property rights, or because someone has influenced the government to violate people's property rights. Either way, it is a government failure, not a market failure, that is to blame for coercive monopolies. But there's another way a company might become a monopoly. A company might produce such high value at such low price that consumers don't want to buy anywhere else. Let's call this a cooperative monopoly. A cooperative monopoly exists only by the grace of consumers. So long as the cooperative monopoly continues to provide what consumers want at prices they're willing to pay, consumers will voluntarily hand over their money, and this company will remain the dominant seller. But the moment the cooperative monopoly falters, consumers will choose a new champion. For example, Sears pioneered mail-order retailing. 4 times a year, Sears would mail catalogs to homes throughout the country. These 1,000-page tomes contained listings for kitchen utensils, clothing, furniture, appliances, tools, toys, cars, and even entire houses. Over the course of a half-century, Sears came to account for almost 1/3 of all U.S. retail sales. At its height, Sears, by itself, constituted 1% of the entire U.S. economy. People became concerned about Sears' dominance because they forgot why Sears was dominant. Sears was not a coercive monopoly. It was a cooperative monopoly. This became clear in the 1980s when Sears' quality fell and its prices rose. And along came Walmart. Like Sears, Walmart offered a wide selection of products, but whereas Sears periodically offered low prices, Walmart promised everyday low prices. Customers withheld their dollars from Sears and offered them instead to Walmart. Sears, once the largest retailer on the planet, began a decade-long slide into bankruptcy. At first, people cheered as Walmart brought them more value and lower prices. Then their cheers turned to gasps as they watched Walmart become the new dominant retailer. People saw a greedy Walmart driving out mom-and-pop shops in pursuit of profit. They clamored for the government to do something. Except Walmart wasn't to blame. In all its history, Walmart hasn't forced a single small shop to close. We did that. We forced the mom-and-pop shops to close when we chose to abandon them in pursuit of lower prices and wider selection. Yet we thought Walmart a predator because we forgot that the reason Walmart was dominant was because we chose to make it so. And then came Amazon. When Amazon arrived offering still lower prices, a wider selection of products, and home delivery, we withheld our dollars from Walmart and offered them to Amazon. Today, people complain that Amazon is a monopoly, yet if it is a cooperative, not a coercive one. And that means that somewhere, right this moment, there is an entrepreneur designing an even better service that in 5 years will challenge Amazon and in 10 replace it as the dominant retailer. Cooperative monopolies are good because they arise from choice. Coercive monopolies are bad because they arise from force. The first thing to know about monopolies is that almost all of the examples people point to aren't. The second thing to know about monopolies is that it doesn't matter that there's one dominant company. It matters why there's one dominant company. The third thing to know about monopolies is that the coercive ones represent missed opportunities. There exist today government-protected coercive monopolies that, had they not been protected for decades, might well have evolved to solve two of our most pressing problems. These monopolies are labor unions. There's nothing wrong with or anti-market about a labor union. If it's okay for investors to come together to form a corporation, if it's okay for worshipers to come together to form a church, if it's okay for nerds to come together to form Star Trek fan clubs, then it must be okay for workers to come together to form unions. Unions aren't the problem. Government protection of unions is. For example, the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931 prohibits the federal government from paying non-union workers less than it pays union workers. This makes it harder for non-union workers to compete. The Wagner Act of 1935 prohibits rivals from competing with established unions, meaning that workers who dislike their union are unable to shop around for a better one. In protecting unions from competition, the government made it more profitable for unions to please regulators than to please workers. As a consequence, unions have become more skilled at lobbying than at providing value. But what if unions had not been able to rely on government for protection? What if, like Sears, then Walmart, now Amazon, unions had to find ways to convince rather than to force workers to join? If they had to compete, unions might have evolved to provide health insurance for Americans at large. It would have been health insurance that followed you no matter where you worked or even if you worked, because it would have been attached to you, not to your employer. And unions would have had a profit incentive to push for lower healthcare prices and price transparency. If they had to compete, unions might have fixed the problem of the rising cost of higher education. You don't need a college degree to become a plumber or electrician or a carpenter, but you also don't need a college degree to become an accountant, a manager, a marketer, a financial advisor, a web developer, or a graphic designer. You can learn what you need to know to do these jobs in 1 or 2 years of coursework. The only reason these jobs require college degrees is because colleges refuse to certify you as proficient unless you pay for 4 years' worth of courses, at least half of which are irrelevant to your job. And colleges get away with this because, through a combination of the accreditation system and student loan programs, colleges are also government-protected monopolies. If they had to compete, unions might have evolved to replace many colleges by offering more relevant and lower-priced educations. We've talked about bad monopolies. We've talked about good monopolies. But what about monopolies that hide in plain sight? In 2016, many voters thought Hillary a power-hungry egotist and Trump a crazy person, but Americans held their noses and voted. In 2020, many voters thought Biden a doddering closet racist and Trump a crazy person, but Americans held their noses and voted. In 2024, many voters thought Harris an authoritarian socialist and Trump a crazy person, but Americans held their noses and voted. In election after election, Americans left, right, and center have come to suspect that something about our electoral system is broken. We point to the Electoral College. We point to winner-take-all voting. We point to campaign financing. We point to a two-party system. But these aren't the problem. The problem is monopoly. The Democratic and Republican parties are not governmental bodies. They are corporations and government-protected coercive monopolies. For example, to appear on the ballot in Georgia, third-party candidates must obtain signatures from 5% of registered voters. Democratic and Republican candidates require no signatures. To appear on the ballot in Illinois, third-party candidates must obtain 25,000 signatures. Democratic and Republican candidates only need 5,000. Federal taxpayer money is readily available for Democratic and Republican candidates, but not for third-party candidates. The Commission on Presidential Debates restricts third-party candidates from participating in the televised debates. But the Commission on Presidential Debates is also not a governmental body. It is a nonprofit corporation sponsored by the Democratic and Republican parties. Monopolies aren't the dragons we think they are. Monopolies that arise because they provide enough value that consumers don't want to shop anywhere else are a blessing, not a curse. They exist only by the grace of consumers. But monopolies that arise because the government has empowered them to stifle competition are a different matter. They exist because the government has failed to protect or has actively violated consumers' and competitors' property rights. Coercive monopolies are a curse. But these aren't the real dragons. The real dragons are those monopolies that masquerade as the government itself. They offer us candidates, but only their candidates. They encourage debate, but only with each other. They ask us to vote, but only among those they choose. These monopolies, the Democratic and Republican parties, are the dragons we should fear, because they do far worse than influence the rule makers. They are the rule makers.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.